The small cafe buzzed with the hum of customers chatting, cups clinking, and the occasional hiss of steam from the coffee machines. Outside, a chilly wind swept through the streets, sending shivers down the spines of anyone caught unprepared. The cafe was a sanctuary from the biting cold, a haven where people buried themselves in their drinks and conversations, oblivious to the world around them. The doorbell jingled, and a frail old man shuffled in, barely able to lift his feet from the ground. His tattered coat hung loosely on his hunched frame, and his trembling hands clutched a battered wallet. The room's atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly as the man entered. Patrons exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to thinly veiled disdain. The old man hesitated near the entrance, his eyes scanning the cafe for an empty seat. The lively conversations seemed to quiet for a moment as his presence disrupted the comfortable normalcy. Slowly, he moved to the counter, his shoes scuffing against the floor, leaving faint streaks of melted snow behind him. Behind the counter stood the manager, a middle-aged man with a stern face and an apron that bore the marks of a long day. The man's cold eyes narrowed as the elderly customer approached, clearly unimpressed by the man's disheveled appearance. The old man cleared his throat, his voice barely audible above the background noise. "A glass of water, please," he murmured, placing a few coins on the counter. The manager's lip curled into a sneer as he picked up the coins. "We don't just serve water here," he said loudly, drawing the attention of a few customers nearby. "This is a cafe, not a charity. If you're not buying something, you need to leave." The old man's face fell, his shoulders slumping further under the weight of humiliation. He reached into his pocket, fumbling for a few more coins, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The cafe patrons watched the scene unfold, some with mild amusement, others with uncomfortable glances. No one spoke up, and no one intervened. The old man's struggle was laid bare for all to see, and yet, he was utterly alone. The old man finally managed to pull out another coin, adding it to the meager pile on the counter. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "Just a glass of water. I'll sit quietly and not bother anyone." His words carried a quiet desperation, the kind that hinted at years of hardship and a life lived on the margins. The manager sighed dramatically, scooping up the coins. "Fine," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. He filled a small glass with water and slammed it on the counter, spilling a few drops. "Here. Now sit somewhere out of the way, and don't cause any trouble." The old man took the glass with both hands, his frail body visibly shaking as he turned to find a seat. In the corner of the cafe, a well-dressed woman sat with her laptop open, sipping a steaming latte. She had been watching the interaction from the start, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Her manicured fingers paused over the keyboard as she studied the old man. Something about him caught her attention, a faint but familiar scar on his wrist that made her heart skip a beat. The old man settled into a corner seat, his small glass of water dwarfed by the elaborate drinks and plates of food around him. Whispers rippled through the cafe as other patrons commented on the scene, their words just loud enough to ensure he could hear. "Can you believe he came in here with no money?" one woman murmured to her companion. "Some people have no shame," another added with a dismissive shake of her head. The old man stared down at his water, his face a mask of quiet resignation. He had long grown used to such treatment, but it didn't make it any easier to endure. Each whispered remark cut like a knife, reopening old wounds of humiliation and rejection. The room felt colder now, despite the warmth of the cafe, and the old man wrapped his hands tightly around the glass as if it were his last source of comfort. Meanwhile, the woman in the corner closed her laptop and rose to her feet. Her elegant coat swished around her as she approached the old man, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The other patrons watched curiously, their whispers dying down as she reached his table. Her gaze lingered on the scar on his wrist, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman turned to the cafe manager, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," she said, drawing everyone's attention. "Is this how you treat all your customers?" The manager looked up, startled, and then his face darkened with irritation. "He's not a customer," he snapped. "He's just some old man who came in here looking for a handout." The woman's eyes narrowed, and her tone took on an edge of steel. "He paid for his water, didn't he? That makes him a customer. And if this is how you treat paying customers, then I'm not sure I want to continue supporting this establishment." The manager stammered, caught off guard by her pointed words. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably, their earlier amusement now tinged with guilt. The old man looked up at the woman, his expression a mix of confusion and gratitude. For the first time in a long while, someone had come to his defense. But as she spoke, the woman's gaze kept returning to the scar on his wrist. "Sir," she said gently, "may I ask where you got that scar?" Her question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken significance. The old man hesitated, his gnarled fingers brushing over the faded mark on his wrist. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "It's an old story," he said, his eyes distant. "From a time when I was much younger, and the world seemed kinder." The woman's breath caught in her throat as fragments of a long-buried memory began to surface. She knelt beside his chair, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the scar. Did you work in a factory many years ago?" she asked, her voice shaking with emotion. The old man's eyes widened in surprise, and he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "I worked in a factory when I was a young man. It was a hard life, but it was all I knew." "Why do you ask?" The woman's eyes filled with tears as she took his hand in hers. "Because," she said softly, "I think you saved my father's life." The old man froze, his frail hands trembling in hers as her words sank in. His brow furrowed in confusion. "Your father?" he repeated, his voice unsteady. The woman nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It was a long time ago, but I've never forgotten the story. My father worked in a factory that caught fire. He told me about a man, a stranger, who pulled him from the flames. He always said that man had a scar just like this one." The cafe fell silent as every pair of eyes turned toward the scene. The old man's expression softened as distant memories stirred. He closed his eyes, the lines on his face deepening as he recalled that fateful day. "There was a fire," he said slowly, his voice growing steadier. "The machines overheated, and everything went up in flames so fast. I was young then, strong enough to help pull people out." He paused, looking at her intently. "Your father, he was the one pinned under the debris, wasn't he?" The woman nodded, her voice breaking. "He told me you refused to leave him even when the roof was about to collapse. You saved his life, and he never stopped talking about you. But he said he never got your name, and he spent years trying to find you." Her words hung in the air like a heavy mist, enveloping them in a shared memory of heroism and loss. The old man's hands shook more violently now, but this time it wasn't from weakness, it was from the overwhelming flood of emotions. He stared at her, his eyes glistening. "Your father," he whispered, "was the bravest man I ever met. Even in the face of death, he kept urging me to save others before coming back for him." The woman's tears streamed freely as she reached into her bag, pulling out an old photograph. It was faded and creased, but the image of a younger man, smiling beside a little girl, was unmistakable. "This was my father," she said, placing the photo in the old man's trembling hands. His breath hitched as he recognized the face. "That's him," he said hoarsely, his voice cracking. "That's the man I couldn't leave behind. I never thought I'd see his face again, let alone meet his daughter." The connection between them was electric, a bond forged decades ago in the heat of a disaster, now reignited in a small cafe on an ordinary day. The cafe manager, who had been watching the scene unfold, took a nervous step forward. His earlier arrogance was replaced with visible discomfort. I didn't know," he stammered, struggling to meet the woman's piercing gaze. "If I'd known who he was." "You didn't need to know," the woman interrupted, her voice sharp. "All you needed to do was treat him with basic decency, but you couldn't even manage that." She turned back to the old man, her tone softening. "Please, let me buy you a proper meal. It's the least I can do." The old man hesitated, glancing around the cafe. The other patrons, now deeply embarrassed by their earlier indifference, avoided his eyes. "I don't want to cause any trouble," he murmured, but the woman shook her head. "You've caused no trouble," she said firmly. "In fact, you've reminded everyone here of what it means to be truly human." As the woman ordered a hearty meal for the old man, she began to share more about her family's history. Her father had survived the fire but bore the scars of that day for the rest of his life. "He used to say that every breath he took after that day was thanks to you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He always hoped he'd get the chance to thank you properly." The old man listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the table. "I never expected gratitude," he said finally. "I just did what I could. But it warms my heart to know he remembered me." The woman reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "You didn't just save his life, you saved our entire family." The cafe grew quiet again, the weight of her words settling over everyone. The other patrons, who had initially dismissed the old man as a nuisance, now looked at him with a mix of awe and shame. The manager retreated to the kitchen, his face pale, as the woman's words continued to echo in the air. The old man ate the meal in silence, each bite tasting richer than anything he had eaten in years. The woman sat across from him, watching him with a mix of gratitude and sadness. Her mind wandered to the stories her father had told her about that fateful day, the smoke, the chaos, and the selflessness of a stranger who risked his own life to save others. She couldn't help but wonder what had happened to this man after the fire, what trials had led him to this moment in a cafe, humiliated for simply asking for water. When he finally finished his meal, he pushed the plate away gently, folding his hands on the table. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The woman shook her head. "You've already done more for my family than I could ever repay. I only wish my father were still here to thank you himself." She hesitated, then added, "He passed away 5 years ago, but he spoke of you until his last breath." The old man's eyes glistened, but he smiled faintly. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "Your father was a good man. If he found peace in the end, that's all that matters." They sat together for a while longer, the silence between them comforting rather than awkward. Around them, the cafe patrons began to stir, returning to their conversations, but there was a subtle shift in the air, a sense of reverence and shame that lingered like the scent of freshly brewed coffee. As the woman prepared to leave, she turned to the cafe manager. Her voice was calm, but her words carried the weight of authority. "I hope you've learned something today," she said. You judged this man by his appearance and treated him with cruelty. That's not how you run a business, and it's certainly not how you treat a fellow human being." The manager swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance replaced with a humble demeanor. "You're right," he admitted, his voice low. "I made a mistake, and I'm sorry." He turned to the old man, bowing his head slightly. "Please forgive me. I shouldn't have treated you that way." The old man looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "It's not me you need to apologize to," he said. "It's every person you've ever judged unfairly. But I accept your apology, and I hope it means you'll treat the next person with kindness." The manager nodded, visibly moved by the man's grace. Before leaving, the woman approached the counter and pulled out her wallet. "I'd like to pay for his meal," she said, "and for any other meals he may need in the future." The manager hesitated, then nodded, accepting the money with a quiet thank you. The woman turned back to the old man, pressing a small envelope into his hands. "Take this," she said firmly. "It's not much, but it might help you get through the winter." The old man tried to protest, but she silenced him with a look. "My father would have wanted this," she said. "Please, let me do this for you." As she left the cafe, the patrons watched her go, their expressions a mixture of admiration and guilt. The old man sat quietly for a while, staring at the envelope in his hands. He felt the weight of her kindness and the unspoken promise it carried, that he was not invisible, that his life mattered. The old man remained in the cafe for a while longer, savoring the rare warmth of a full stomach and a comfortable seat. A few patrons approached him hesitantly, offering quiet words of apology or gestures of goodwill. One woman placed a small bag of groceries on the table before leaving, while another slipped a few bills into his hand without a word. He looked around the room, marveling at the change in atmosphere. Just hours ago, he had felt like an intruder, an unwelcome presence in a space that didn't belong to him. Now, he felt a sense of belonging, however fleeting it might be. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope that things could get better. As he stood to leave, the manager approached him, his face earnest. "If you ever need a place to sit and rest," he said, "you're welcome here. No charge." The old man nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Thank you," he said simply, and with that, he stepped out into the cold, his heart a little lighter than before. The cold wind bit at the old man's face as he stepped out of the cafe, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a faint spark of purpose. He glanced at the bustling street around him, the steady rhythm of people rushing past, each absorbed in their own world. Yet, for the first time, he didn't feel entirely invisible. As he walked down the street, memories of his past crept into his thoughts. He had once been a proud man, working hard to provide for his family. The fire that had left him with the scar on his wrist had also marked the beginning of his downfall. The factory had closed shortly after, leaving him without a job. One hardship led to another, and over time, he found himself slipping through the cracks of society. Yet today, something had changed. The kindness of a stranger had reminded him of the man he used to be, a man who didn't give up easily. As he passed by a community center, a notice board caught his eye. Among the various flyers and advertisements was a poster offering free job training programs for the elderly. He paused, his heart racing with uncertainty. Could this be a chance to reclaim some part of his life? The old man returned to the small room he called home, a cramped, dimly lit space at the back of a shelter. He sat on the edge of his cot, carefully opening the envelope the woman had given him. Inside was a modest amount of cash and a handwritten note. The note read, "For the man who reminded me that courage never fades. Use this to start anew." My father believed in second chances, and so do I. Tears welled up in his eyes as he read the words. He carefully folded the note and tucked it into his pocket, the cash remaining untouched on the cot beside him. He didn't want to spend it frivolously. It felt too precious, like a gift meant to guide him towards something meaningful. The poster from the community center lingered in his mind, and as he lay down that night, he made a silent vow to visit the center the next day. Perhaps, he thought, this was the second chance he had never dared to hope for. The following morning, the old man arrived at the community center. The warmth of the building was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside, and he hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The receptionist greeted him with a kind smile, her eyes free of judgment. "How can we help you today?" she asked. He explained that he had seen the poster about job training programs, his voice faltering slightly with nerves. The receptionist nodded and handed him a form. "You're in the right place," she said. "We have programs for all kinds of skills, cooking, maintenance work, even computer basics. Let's find something that suits you." As he filled out the form, a sense of determination began to take root within him. This was unfamiliar territory, and the path ahead seemed daunting, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward. Back at the cafe, the manager couldn't shake the image of the old man's trembling hands or the woman's stern words. Guilt gnawed at him, and he found himself reflecting on his own behavior. He had always prided himself on running a successful business, but he realized now that success meant little if it came at the cost of humanity. He decided to take action. That evening, he called a staff meeting and addressed his employees with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I made a mistake today," he admitted. "I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment, and I treated someone unfairly. That's not the kind of place I want this cafe to be." The staff listened intently as he announced a new policy. The cafe would now offer free water and a safe space for anyone in need, regardless of their ability to pay. The announcement was met with mixed reactions, but the manager stood firm. "If we can afford to serve gourmet lattes," he said, "we can afford to show a little kindness." The old man returned to the community center each day, immersing himself in the training programs. He chose to focus on maintenance work, drawing on skills he had honed during his years at the factory. The work was challenging, but he found a sense of pride in learning again. His instructors were patient, encouraging him every step of the way. Slowly, the old man began to regain confidence in himself. He even made a few friends among the other trainees, forming connections he hadn't experienced in years. One evening, as he walked back to the shelter, he passed by the cafe. Through the window, he saw the manager speaking warmly to a young man who looked down on his luck. The sight filled him with quiet satisfaction, knowing that his own experience had sparked a ripple of change. Weeks passed, and the old man's life began to take on a rhythm. Mornings were spent at the community center, learning new skills and lending a hand wherever he could. Afternoons were a time for reflection, often spent in the park or at the library, places he had avoided for years out of fear of judgment. Each day, he felt a little more like the person he had been before life's hardships wore him down. The woman from the cafe, whose name he learned was Eleanor, kept in touch. She called occasionally, always with a warm tone and thoughtful questions about his progress. One day, she visited him at the community center, surprising him during a break. "I wanted to see how you were doing," she said, her smile genuine. He gestured to the tools around him, explaining the work he was learning to do. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with pride. "My father would have been so proud to see this," she said softly. "You're proving what he always believed, that it's never too late to rebuild." The old man nodded, her words resonating deeply. Back at the cafe, the manager had undergone his own quiet transformation. He began treating every customer with more patience and respect, regardless of their appearance or the size of their order. The staff noticed the change, and gradually, the atmosphere of the cafe shifted. One afternoon, the manager spotted the old man walking past the window. He hurried outside, catching him just before he disappeared down the street. "Wait," he called. The old man turned, his expression cautious but curious. "I wanted to give you something," the manager said, handing him a small card. It was a prepaid meal card for the cafe. "You can use this anytime," he explained. "I know it doesn't make up for how I treated you, but I hope it shows that I'm trying to be better." The old man studied the card for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you," he said simply, tucking it into his pocket. The story of the cafe incident had spread beyond its walls, carried by the patrons who had witnessed it. Local blogs and social media posts shared the tale of a wealthy woman standing up for an elderly man, and the unexpected connection that followed. Soon, the cafe became known as a place where kindness was served alongside coffee. Customers began paying it forward, leaving extra money at the counter to cover meals for those in need. A small bulletin board was installed near the entrance, where people could leave notes of encouragement or share resources for the community. The cafe's reputation grew, not for its menu but for its heart. The old man found himself returning to the cafe more often, not just to use the meal card but to sit and watch the world go by. He noticed how the space had changed, how the staff now greeted every customer with genuine warmth. He even struck up conversations with some of the regulars, rediscovering the joy of human connection. One day, the director of the community center approached the old man with an offer. "There's a maintenance position opening up at a local school," she said. "It's part-time, but I think you'd be perfect for it. Are you interested?" The old man hesitated, the weight of his past failures pressing against him. But then he remembered Eleanor's words and the note she had given him. Second chances. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. "I'd like to try," he said. The application process was daunting, but the staff at the community center helped him every step of the way. When he received the call offering him the job, he felt a surge of pride he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just about the money, it was about reclaiming a sense of purpose. The day before he started his new job, the old man visited the cafe. He ordered a simple cup of coffee, paid for with the meal card, and sat by the window. Eleanor happened to walk in, and her face lit up when she saw him. "I have news," he told her, his voice steady but brimming with emotion. "I got a job. It's not much, but it's something." Eleanor beamed, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "That's wonderful," she said. "You've worked so hard for this, and you deserve every bit of it." The cafe manager, overhearing their conversation, brought over a plate of pastries on the house. "Congratulations," he said with a smile. The old man thanked him, his heart full of gratitude for how far he had come. The first day of his new job at the school was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. The old man arrived early, his neatly pressed second-hand shirt and slacks a testament to his determination to make a good impression. The school's principal, a kind woman with a warm smile, greeted him at the entrance and introduced him to the staff. "This is Mr. Callahan," she said, addressing a group of teachers and maintenance workers. "He'll be helping with upkeep around the school." I hope you'll all give him a warm welcome." The staff clapped politely, and a few stepped forward to shake his hand. Their genuine kindness eased the old man's nerves, and he felt a flicker of confidence take hold. His tasks were simple but meaningful: fixing broken desks, changing light bulbs, and ensuring the school was safe and functional. He took pride in his work, remembering the satisfaction he used to feel during his days at the factory. As he walked through the halls, children would pass him with shy waves and curious glances. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere again. That evening, the old man returned home exhausted but content. As he settled into his small room, his phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. "How did your first day go?" He smiled as he typed back, "Better than I expected. Thank you for believing in me." The following weekend, Eleanor invited him to her home for dinner. Her house was modest but elegant, filled with personal touches and family photographs. She introduced him to her husband and 2 young daughters, who greeted him warmly. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," her husband said, shaking his hand. "Eleanor's told us so much about you." As they sat down to eat, Eleanor shared stories about her father, recounting his humor, resilience, and the deep admiration he had for the man who saved him. The old man listened quietly, his heart swelling with both sorrow and gratitude. After dinner, Eleanor handed him a small box. Inside was a wristwatch, its band gleaming with polished metal. "This was my father's," she said, her voice soft. "He always said he wished he could give it to the man who saved his life. Now, I'm giving it to you." The old man's hands trembled as he took the watch, his eyes filling with tears. "I don't know if I deserve this," he murmured, but Eleanor shook her head. "You do. You've always deserved it." Word of the old man's efforts at the school spread quickly. Teachers praised his reliability and kindness, and students began greeting him by name. One day, a young boy approached him in the hallway, holding a broken toy. "Can you fix this?" the boy asked shyly, his eyes full of hope. The old man knelt down and examined the toy. "I think I can," he said, smiling. He spent his lunch break repairing it, and when he handed it back to the boy, the child's face lit up with joy. Moments like these became the highlights of his days, small reminders that his work mattered. Eleanor continued to visit him at the school occasionally, bringing her daughters to meet the students and sharing ideas for how the community could better support the school. She even donated supplies and helped organize a fundraiser, inspired by the old man's resilience and determination. Meanwhile, the cafe had transformed into a community hub. The manager's decision to embrace kindness had paid off, attracting customers who valued its welcoming atmosphere. The bulletin board at the entrance was now filled with messages of encouragement and small acts of generosity: a coffee prepaid for a stranger, a job referral for someone in need. One afternoon, the old man stopped by the cafe after work. He noticed a group of young people helping an elderly woman carry her groceries. As he watched them, he couldn't help but think about how far the cafe had come since the day he walked in, humiliated and desperate. The manager greeted him warmly and handed him a cup of coffee. "On the house," he said with a grin. The old man nodded his thanks and took a seat by the window, watching the world move around him with quiet contentment. One evening, Eleanor handed the old man a neatly folded piece of paper. "I found this among my father's belongings," she said. "I thought you should have it." The old man unfolded the letter and began to read. It was a note her father had written years ago, expressing his gratitude to the man who had saved his life. "To the stranger who risked everything for me," the letter began. "You taught me the value of courage, selflessness, and humanity. I only hope I can live a life worthy of your sacrifice. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart." The old man clutched the letter to his chest, his heart heavy with emotion. "He was a good man," he said quietly. "I'm glad he lived a full life." The old man became a beloved figure at the school, known not just for his hard work but for the kindness and wisdom he shared with the children. He often told them stories about his past, emphasizing the importance of resilience and compassion. One day, a girl approached him after class and asked, "Why do you always help people, Mr. Callahan?" He smiled and replied, "Because someone once helped me when I needed it most. And if you can do the same for someone else, you should." The girl nodded thoughtfully, and the old man felt a sense of peace. He had come full circle, passing on the values that had saved him to the next generation. Years later, the old man sat on a park bench, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the world. His life had been far from perfect, but as he reflected on the journey he had taken, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. In his pocket, he carried two items: the watch Eleanor had given him and the letter from her father. Together, they were symbols of a life touched by both hardship and redemption, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always hope. As he watched children playing in the park, their laughter echoing in the air, he smiled. He had not only reclaimed his own life but had left a legacy of kindness and courage that would endure long after he was gone.